The war was over. The world had rebuilt. Children of peace had been born. Men had walked on the moon. Yet deep inside the jungles of Lubang Island, one man still fought. His uniform was tattered, the metal of his rifle eaten by rust, but his eyes burned with duty. He moved silently through the trees, believing every shadow could hide the enemy. Every voice on the wind could be a trick from the Americans. To him, World War II had never ended. His name was Hiroo Onoda, the soldier who fought for 29 years after the war was already lost. On March 9, 1974, the Philippine Army and a young Japanese traveler ventured into this dense forest carrying an impossible message, a message that said, "Lieutenant Onoda, the war ended 29 years ago. Japan has surrendered." For nearly 3 decades, Onoda had refused to believe such words. He had seen leaflets dropped from planes, heard broadcasts on crackling radios, all dismissed as enemy propaganda. But this time, the order came from a familiar hand, the one man he still trusted above all. And that moment, on that humid afternoon in 1974, the last soldier of the Second World War finally lowered his rifle. What kind of belief keeps a man fighting for almost 30 years after the world has moved on? What code of honor could hold his mind hostage against time itself? This is his story. The story of Hiroo Onoda, the loyal soldier, the ghost of a forgotten war, and the man who refused to surrender. To understand Onoda's world, you must step into Japan in the 1930s, an empire on the rise, fueled by discipline, nationalism, and an unbreakable faith in the emperor. Young men were raised to believe that duty was sacred, that surrender was shame, and that dying for the emperor was the highest honor. Hiroo Onoda was born in 1922 in the city of Kainan, Wakayama Prefecture. He was a curious boy, quiet, thoughtful, but drawn to the call of adventure. His father was stern, a veteran of earlier conflicts. From him, Onoda learned one lesson that would define his life: never yield. By his late teens, the empire's drums of war were echoing across Asia. When Japan invaded China and the Pacific tensions grew, Onoda, like many of his generation, felt destiny pulling him into the ranks. In 1942, at age 20, he was drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army. Training was merciless. Recruits were broken down, rebuilt as instruments of will. They were taught that the emperor's word was absolute, and that even in isolation, a soldier must never surrender, never die without purpose. Onoda showed remarkable intelligence. He was not the strongest, but he was meticulous, disciplined, and brave. His instructors saw potential beyond a common infantryman. In 1944, with the war turning against Japan, he was selected for special training in intelligence and guerrilla warfare. At the Nakano school, Japan's elite training ground for intelligence officers, Onoda learned the arts of sabotage, camouflage, psychological resistance, and survival behind enemy lines. There he was told a mantra: "You will live to destroy the enemy's will. Even if all communication is lost, you will continue your mission. You will never surrender. You will die when your task is done." Those words would echo in his mind for the next 3 decades. In December 1944, the Empire's command sent him to a small island in the Philippines, Lubang Island, a place most of the world had never heard of. His mission: to slow the American advance, destroy enemy airstrips and docks, gather intelligence, and above all, never surrender alive. He arrived with a small group of men. Within weeks, the American invasion reached the island. Onoda and his unit retreated into the jungles, waging guerrilla attacks. They believed reinforcements would come, that Japan still fought on. But as months turned into years, the world beyond the trees had changed. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had burned. Japan had surrendered. The emperor had spoken the words, "Endure the unendurable." And yet, for Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, those words never reached the jungle. Cut off from command, he clung to his final orders: sabotage, intelligence, resistance. He and a handful of men built hidden camps, raided villages for food, and repaired weapons with stolen parts. The war, for them, had become a ghost, but to Onoda, ghosts were still enemies. When American planes dropped leaflets announcing Japan's surrender, he studied them under lamplight. Suspicious. Propaganda, he decided. Tricks to lure us out. He even found a newspaper article years later, describing Japan's defeat. Still, he refused to believe. "The paper could be printed by the enemy," he wrote. "Until an officer of my command tells me otherwise, my war continues." And so it did. Months, turned to years. His comrades died one by one, in firefights from hunger or disease. By 1950, only Onoda remained, moving through the dense green world like a phantom. He built shelters of bamboo, stole rice from farmers, mended his uniform with vines. Every gunshot from hunters, every echo of thunder, could be the start of another battle. He kept a small diary written on pages of a weathered notebook, recording rainfall, crop patterns, and imagined troop movements. A meticulous war against time itself. The world forgot him. Japan rebuilt itself into a nation of peace and industry. Neon lights filled Tokyo, but on a remote island thousands of miles away, one soldier still patrolled his post, faithful, unbroken, invisible. The rain never stopped. For Onoda, it was both an enemy and a friend, washing away tracks, masking his movement but soaking every scrap of paper he tried to keep dry. Months after the final gunfire of 1945, he still cleaned his rifle daily, boiled what rice he could steal, and checked the horizon for the silhouettes of landing craft that would never come. The jungle swallowed everything. Paths overgrew within weeks. Huts melted back into earth. To live, he had to learn the language of the island, its birds, its shifting winds, the way the cicadas fell silent before a storm. Sometimes he would see a Philippine farmer across the fields. To the farmer, he was a ghost of a forgotten war. To Onoda, the farmer was an enemy scout. Shots rang out. Lives were lost for misunderstandings written in the language of fear. In 1949, his comrade Shimada was wounded during one of these clashes. They built a lean-to beside a riverbank, dressing the wound with cloth and herbs. For months, Onoda carried him when he could no longer walk. But the jungle is merciless. Infection crept in. Shimada died in Onoda's arms. He buried him beneath a banyan tree, marking the grave with his bayonet. "You fulfilled your orders," he whispered. "I will fulfill mine." The world occasionally remembered the ghosts in the Pacific. Leaflets were printed in Japanese, photos of Onoda's family included, pleading, "The war is over. Come home." He examined one carefully under moonlight, tracing his mother's face with his finger. Then he folded it, placed it in his pack, and whispered, "Clever. But you will not fool me." Decades blurred. 1950 became 1960, then 1970. He repaired his uniform until it was more patch than cloth, sharpened blades on river stones, wrapped his feet in bark when shoes dissolved. Every sunrise was a new patrol. Every sunset, a report written to a command that no longer existed. He imagined his superiors still waiting in Tokyo, reviewing his invisible dispatches. To surrender would mean betraying them, betraying the oath that had defined his entire life. Back home, Japan's miracle of rebirth was underway. Young men in suits rode the subway, unaware that a lone officer still fought for the emperor's honor on a forgotten island. Television shows joked about stragglers, but for Onoda, this was no comedy. It was the line between duty and disgrace. In 1972, two Japanese fishermen on holiday stumbled upon him. They shouted in Japanese, words of peace, of surrender. But the moment Onoda saw their modern clothes, he dove back into the trees. Rumors spread. A Japanese soldier is still alive out there. The story reached Tokyo. Newspapers called it the man who time forgot. The Japanese embassy confirmed, yes, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda had never been reported dead. Among the many who read the headlines was a young adventurer named Norio Suzuki. He was 24, restless, searching for meaning in a peaceful world. "I will find 3 things," he told his friends. A panda, a wild, abominable snowman, and Lieutenant Onoda. They laughed. But in early 1974, he sailed to the Philippines with nothing but a camera, a map, and faith. Days of trekking brought him to a clearing near the river. A rustle. A man emerged, thin, armed, eyes hard as iron. Suzuki raised his hands and spoke in careful Japanese. "Onoda-san, the war is over. Japan has changed." Silence. Then Onoda replied, voice low, "If Japan has truly surrendered, bring me my commanding officer. Only he can relieve me of my duty." Suzuki bowed. "I will return," he said. And he did. The year was 1974. The jungles of Lubang were quiet that morning. Quiet in the way only a place can be when it holds its breath. The young Japanese traveler, Norio Suzuki, had returned. Weeks earlier, he had vanished into this same forest and emerged with an impossible story. That he had spoken to a soldier from another world, one who still fought the Second World War. The embassy doubted him. Some laughed. Others feared it was a trap. But Suzuki's photographs, grainy, haunting images of a man in a worn uniform holding a rusted rifle, were proof enough. Now, Suzuki returned not with weapons, but with a promise to bring the man home. In his pack, he carried letters, a flag, and an old photograph. He also carried orders, written by the very commander who had once sent Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda to this jungle 3 decades earlier. The name on the paper, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. Taniguchi had survived the war and become a bookseller in Japan. When he heard Onoda was alive, he wept. "If he is still obeying my command," Taniguchi said, "then it is my duty to go and release him." A small team, led by Suzuki and Taniguchi, landed on Lubang Island in early March. They hiked for hours through tangled undergrowth, guided by locals who whispered about the ghost soldier. As dusk settled, they stopped in a small clearing near a stream, the same place where Suzuki had first seen him. Taniguchi called out softly in Japanese, "Lieutenant Onoda, this is Major Taniguchi. The war is over. I have come to relieve you of your duties." For a long moment there was only the sound of insects. Then a shape appeared between the trees. He stepped forward slowly, thin, sunburned, yet standing straight as any soldier. His uniform, though patched with leaves, was still neatly kept. His rifle was oiled and ready. For 29 years he had kept it that way. He stared at Taniguchi, eyes wet but steady. Then he saluted, Lieutenant Onoda reporting for duty. "Sir, I await your orders." Taniguchi opened the envelope. The paper trembled in his hand as he read aloud. "In accordance with Imperial Headquarters Command, the 14th Army has ceased all combat operations. The men under my command are to cease hostilities immediately and return to their homeland. Signed, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, March 9, 1974. Onoda stood silent. He lowered his rifle, eyes fixed on the jungle floor. Decades of noise and fear seemed to fall away from him in that instant. He whispered only one word, "Understood." For a moment, the jungle itself seemed to exhale. The last battle of World War II had finally ended. On March 10, 1974, Hiroo Onoda emerged from the jungle in full uniform. His rifle, sword, and more than 500 rounds of ammunition were intact. His appearance stunned the world. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted, "Why didn't you surrender?" one asked. Onoda answered quietly, "We received no orders to stop fighting." He bowed to the Philippine president, Ferdinand Marcos, who granted him a full pardon for any acts committed during his long war. Then he boarded a plane for Japan, the first he had seen since 1944. As the engines roared to life, Onoda pressed his forehead to the window. Clouds drifted below. For the first time, he felt the world move faster than he could understand. When he landed in Tokyo, thousands awaited him. Reporters, photographers, families waving flags. Some called him a hero. Others whispered, "Fool." He stepped off the plane still in uniform, his sword gleaming under the camera lights. The smell of gasoline and perfume filled his senses, nothing like the damp earth and gun oil of his jungle home. Tokyo had changed beyond recognition. Neon lights glowed where bombs had once fallen. Children played arcade games, not war drills. The emperor was now a symbol, not a god. Reporters asked what he would do next. Onoda replied, "I will try to understand this new Japan, but it may take me another 30 years. The government offered him money, books, interviews. He refused most. "I am a soldier," he said, "not a celebrity." He spent hours walking Tokyo's streets at night, watching the neon reflections in puddles, wondering how the war had vanished so completely. Some veterans reached out in tears. Others turned away, unwilling to remember. To many young Japanese, he was an echo from a time they could not comprehend, a living ghost from their grandparents' stories. The older generation saw in him something sacred and tragic, the last embodiment of a loyalty so absolute it had consumed a life. Philosophers debated whether he was a hero or a warning. One columnist wrote, "He fought for an empire that no longer existed, and in doing so, he preserved a part of our forgotten conscience." Yet for Onoda, peace was the hardest battlefield. The city noise felt louder than any gunfire. The faces in the crowd were strangers, their expressions soft, unguarded. He missed the rhythm of the jungle, the way every sound had meaning. Every shadow could be life or death. At night, he would wake, expecting to hear the rain against bamboo, the whisper of his comrades in the dark, but there was only silence. In 1975, unable to adapt, he left Japan again, this time by choice. He moved to Brazil, to a ranch gifted by a Japanese expatriate community. There, he raised cattle, rode horses, and watched the sun rise over open fields instead of dense canopy. "I needed space," he said, "to learn how to live again." Over the years, he began to speak publicly, not about war's glory, but about the human need for purpose. "When a man has nothing to fight for," he once said, "he begins to die." He taught survival skills to Japanese youth, lessons not in killing, but in endurance. Discipline, he told them, is freedom, but blind obedience is a cage. In 1984, he finally returned to Lubang Island, this time as a friend. He apologized to the villagers for the lives lost during his long war. They forgave him. Together, they planted trees in memory of the past, turning the place of conflict into a garden of remembrance. As years passed, his legend grew. Books, documentaries, even films told his story. Some romanticized him as the perfect soldier. Others portrayed him as a cautionary tale about indoctrination and isolation. But Onoda never claimed to be either. "I was a soldier who followed orders," he said simply, "and I survived." In January 2014, Hiroo Onoda passed away in Tokyo at the age of 91. The world mourned the man who had lived 3 lives, as a warrior, a wanderer, and a witness. His story closed a chapter that began before many of us were born, a chapter that reminds us of the strange endurance of belief. Even today, deep in forgotten jungles, rusted helmets lie buried under the leaves. Somewhere in that soil are the echoes of voices like his, men who fought, waited, and believed long after the world stopped listening. And maybe, in the end, that's what Hiroo Onoda taught us. That conviction can outlive nations, that loyalty can survive time itself, but that peace must be chosen. In the heart of Brazil, far from the jungles of the Philippines, Hiroo Onoda began to rebuild himself. The land stretched endlessly, open skies, no canopy to hide beneath, no enemies lurking in the shadows. Yet even here, his instincts remained sharp. He woke before dawn. He sharpened tools with the same precision he once gave to his rifle. He patrolled the fence lines, as if guarding an invisible front. The war had ended, but the habits of survival had not. Every morning, he'd walk the fields, hands behind his back, eyes scanning the horizon. When asked what he was looking for, he smiled gently and said, "I am just making sure peace still exists." The people of Brazil respected him. They saw in him not madness, but a strange kind of serenity, a man who had faced the edge of belief and returned alive. Onoda spoke rarely of the war. When he did, his words were measured, as if carved from stone. "I learned," he once told a young reporter, "that truth is not what you hear, but what you can confirm with your own eyes. I trusted my commanders. I trusted my orders. But I forgot to question the silence that followed." In the 1980s, Onoda began teaching survival courses to young Japanese men. He founded what became known as the Onoda Nature School, a place where students would live in the wild for weeks, facing hunger, fatigue, and the unknown. It wasn't about preparing for war. It was about rediscovering discipline in a world that had forgotten hardship. "If you can endure the forest," he told them, "you can endure life." Under his guidance, they learned to light fires in the rain, to read animal tracks, to respect silence. "The jungle is honest," Onoda said. "It never lies," but deep down, he still carried guilt. Guilt for the farmers he'd shot at, believing they were enemy soldiers. Guilt for the comrades who died following orders he'd enforced. During a speech in 1996, his voice cracked for the first time. "When I look back," he said, "I see that my loyalty was pure, but my understanding was limited. I was taught that to die for one's country was the highest honor. Yet perhaps the greater honor is to live for it, and to admit when we were wrong." Onoda's return to Lubang years later was more than symbolic. It was penance. He met the families of those who had suffered during his long war. He bowed deeply, tears streaming down his face. "I cannot bring back the years," he said, "but I can honor them by remembering." That humility touched people across the world. Historians debated his legacy. Was he a hero, a fool, or simply a man lost in time? But to those who heard him speak, Onoda was none of these. He was a mirror, a reminder of what conviction can become when untethered from the world. Japan itself had changed in ways Onoda could barely comprehend. The sons of the soldiers he once fought beside were now businessmen, scientists, and artists. The nation that had sent him to war now taught peace as its proudest lesson. And yet, beneath the neon and noise, a quiet admiration lingered for the soldier who had lived a lifetime in the shadows of duty. In one of his last recorded lectures, Onoda told a group of students, "We live in an age where people surrender too easily, not to enemies, but to doubt, to fear, to comfort. If my story means anything, it is that endurance has its own wisdom. But remember, the courage to stop fighting is sometimes greater than the courage to continue." As he grew older, Onoda spent more time in reflection than routine. "I used to live by seconds," he said, "measuring time between shots, footsteps, and meals. Now I live by sunsets." In his final years, he often visited schools, not to speak of war, but of patience. He told children how he survived on a handful of rice, how stars guided him through darkness, When you think you have nothing, he told them, remember the jungle. Even there, life finds a way. One interviewer once asked him if he regretted anything. He paused, looking at his hands. Regret, he said, is a heavy thing. But it is better to regret what you did for honor than what you did for convenience. Would you do it again? The interviewer asked. Onoda looked into the camera and said quietly, I hope the world never asks that of me again. Today, Lubang is peaceful. Tourists visit its beaches, unaware that the ground beneath once echoed with the footsteps of a man fighting a war long past. The banyan tree where Shimada was buried still stands. Locals say that when the wind passes through its leaves, it sounds like whispers, perhaps the voices of men who never left. Onoda's old camp has been overtaken by vines and silence, nature reclaiming what duty had once held hostage. In 2014, when news of his death reached Lubang, the villagers held a small ceremony by the shore. They placed flowers in the water, watching them drift away with the tide. The war has truly ended now, one elder said. Hiroo Onoda's story is not about war. It is about belief. Belief so strong it could outlast nations, decades, even time itself. But belief without awareness can become blindness. His life stands as both a testament and a warning. Never surrender your humanity to an idea, no matter how noble it may seem. And yet his endurance, his refusal to break, also shows us something beautiful. That within every human being lies the will to continue, even when the world forgets you. For some, that is madness. For others, it is faith. For Hiroo Onoda, it was purpose. As the sun set on his final evening in Brazil, Onoda wrote one last letter. I was ordered to fight, it read, but I chose to live. May peace never again be so fragile that one man could miss its arrival. The story of Hiroo Onoda did not end with his death. In truth, it began again the moment the world asked itself, could I have done the same? Could I hold to a belief for 3 decades against every voice, every proof, every change of the world around me? And if I could, should I? Onoda's name became a kind of mirror. Politicians cited his loyalty. Philosophers questioned his blindness. Soldiers admired his endurance. But beyond those debates lies the real question. What does loyalty mean when the truth has changed? Every generation faces its own kind of battlefield. Some fight with rifles. Others fight with words, with information, with conviction. Onoda's jungle was physical. Ours is digital, invisible, fought inside minds and screens. In his life, orders came from men in uniforms. In ours, they come from headlines, algorithms, and voices shouting certainty into the noise. How different are we, really, from the soldier who refused to surrender until he saw the proof with his own eyes? Maybe the world has changed, but the human heart hasn't. Onoda taught us 3 lessons, simple, harsh, and timeless. Conviction is powerful, but it must serve truth, not pride. When belief stops listening, it becomes a prison. Onoda's strength was also his cage. He survived because he refused to doubt, but he also suffered because he refused to question. In a world built on opinions, his story whispers, be faithful, but not blind. Purpose is the fuel of survival. In the jungle, hunger gnawed at him. Loneliness broke others. What kept him alive wasn't just training, it was meaning. My mission kept me breathing, he said once. Without it, I was nothing. Today, many have food, comfort, and safety, but no mission. They scroll, they drift, they wait for something to fight for. Onoda reminds us, even a flawed purpose can be a lifeline. The challenge is to find one worthy of the fight. Peace is not the absence of battle. It's the choice to stop fighting when the war inside you is over. For nearly 30 years, Onoda could not stop. He was trained to endure, but never taught to let go. We all have jungles, places of memory, pride, or pain where we keep fighting ghosts. His story says, you can put down the rifle. You can walk out of the trees. The world you feared might already be waiting with open hands. When Onoda stepped out of the jungle in 1974, the world greeted him with cameras. Today, if someone like him appeared, we would greet him with hashtags. The stage has changed, but the hunger for meaning has not. We celebrate endurance, yet we rarely practice it. We glorify conviction, yet we mock it when it doesn't match our own. Onoda's life is uncomfortable because it forces us to ask what we truly believe in and how far we would go to defend it. Historians have written thousands of pages about the Second World War, yet Onoda's 30-year battle cannot fit neatly in any of them. It was not strategy or politics. It was the raw endurance of a single human spirit. His war existed entirely between obedience and doubt, between the man he was trained to be and the man he could become. That is why his story endures, because it is not about bullets or flags. It is about identity. Who are you when your purpose disappears? Who do you become when the orders stop coming but the habits remain? Onoda faced those questions alone, under the reign of the Philippine jungle. We face them every time the world changes faster than our understanding can follow. When we hear of him, we often say, "I would never do that." But maybe the truth is we already do. We cling to outdated wars, personal, ideological, emotional, because surrender feels like weakness. Onoda teaches us that surrender is not defeat. It is recognition that the world has moved on and that we are allowed to move with it. Imagine, for a moment, his first night of peace. The jungle quiet, the stars bright above him. No more enemies in sight. Perhaps he lay there wondering, who am I now? That question, more than any gunfire, is what finally ended his war. In classrooms across Japan, students still learn his name. Teachers ask them, "What does duty mean to you?" Some answer, "To obey." Others say, "To endure." But a few whisper what Onoda himself might have said near the end of his life, "To understand." Understanding is the quiet opposite of fanaticism. It listens where obedience silences. It questions where certainty commands. If Hiroo Onoda had been taught to question, perhaps his 30-year war might have lasted only 30 days. And yet, had he not endured, we might never have learned the depth of human resilience. Every paradox of his life, duty and doubt, pride and remorse, belief and awareness, makes his story eternal. It asks us not to choose sides, but to see both. So what is the lesson of Onoda? That a man can be both wrong and remarkable. That faith can save you and destroy you in the same breath. That wars end, but conviction must be guided, or it will wander endlessly like a soldier who cannot find his orders home. And most of all, that the human spirit, when bound to purpose, can outlast history itself. When we tell his story, we are not glorifying a forgotten war. We are remembering the cost of misunderstanding, the danger of blind duty, and the strange beauty of perseverance. Every generation has its Onoda, someone still fighting in yesterday's world, unaware that peace is waiting just beyond the trees. Maybe you are one of them. Maybe you are fighting something that ended long ago. If so, this story is not about him. It's about you. When Hiroo Onoda finally stepped into the modern world, the war was over, the empire gone, the flags replaced, and the faces unfamiliar. Yet somehow, the air still smelled of duty, the same way the jungle smelled of rain. He blinked against the sunlight as cameras flashed. He had become history, a relic who had refused to believe history had changed. Apan had moved on. The war had become memory, then lesson, then myth. But standing there, thin and quiet, dressed in the same uniform from 1945, Onoda looked like a ghost that time had forgotten to bury. To him, the world felt faster, louder, and stranger than any enemy he had faced. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras surrounded him. "How do you feel?" they asked. "What will you do now?" He hesitated, then smiled politely. "I will live," he said. "For the first time, I will live." For the first time, Hiroo Onoda was free, not as a soldier, but as a man. Yet freedom, after 30 years of war, was not easy to hold. He found himself lost again, this time not in jungle vines, but in silence. The mission was gone, the orders gone, the enemies gone. What remained was the question, who am I, if not a soldier? He visited his family, whom he had not seen in decades. He met children who knew his name only from newspapers. He bowed before shrines of those who had died while he hid in the jungle. Every step felt like walking on memories, fragile, sacred, untouchable. But fame soon faded. People moved on to new stories, new heroes, new distractions. For Onoda, the silence of peace became louder than the gunfire of war. He began to travel, searching for a meaning that could replace the one he had lost. In 1975, he moved to Brazil. There, he built a ranch in the quiet countryside, planting trees and raising cattle. He worked under the open sky, and for the first time, the forest was not a battlefield. It was home. Locals called him Senor Onoda. They knew little of his past. To them, he was simply a quiet, disciplined man who smiled easily and worked hard. But at night, when the wind rustled through the grass, he would sometimes look toward the horizon. And in that sound, he heard echoes of the jungle, whispers of voices that would never return. "Forgive me," he once said to a visitor, "for surviving my friends." The world honored him as a symbol of loyalty and endurance. Japan's emperor received him with respect. Newspapers called him the last samurai of the Pacific. But Onoda himself rejected such praise. "I am not a hero," he said quietly. "I was a soldier who followed orders, that is all." Yet whether he wanted it or not, he had become more than that. He had become a question that haunted philosophers, soldiers, and storytellers alike. Is it better to live by conviction, even when it's wrong, or to change when the truth demands it. End time, Onoda returned to Japan. He wrote books. He taught survival skills to children, not to make them warriors, but to make them strong. The jungle taught me that nature will forgive your mistakes, if you learn from them, he said. And perhaps that was his final redemption, to teach a generation how to live, not how to fight. He lived a long life, until 2014, when he passed away peacefully at the age of 91. Around the world, headlines appeared again. The last Japanese soldier dies. The man who refused to surrender finally rests. But even in death, his legend refused to fade. Because Onoda's story is not about a war. It is about the soul that refuses to die, even when the battle is long over. Somewhere deep in the jungle of Lubang Island, the trees still whisper his name. His footprints, long erased by time, seem to linger beneath the leaves. Nature remembers. The island remembers. And so do we. He was not perfect. He killed when peace had already come. He suffered for illusions, and he caused suffering to others. But he also endured when most would have surrendered. He kept his word when the world forgot its promises. That contradiction, that human truth, is why his story endures. Maybe, deep down, we envy him, not for his stubbornness, but for his certainty. In an age where beliefs change every day, where attention is the new currency, Onoda's unshakable conviction feels almost supernatural. But his story warns us. Conviction without understanding is a sword with no handle. It cuts the one who holds it. Chiun, what if we could take Onoda's strength, his endurance, his devotion, and pair it with wisdom? What if loyalty was not to orders but to truth? Then maybe the wars of the heart, the mind, and the soul could finally end. Hiroo Onoda's story began with a gun in his hands and ended with seeds in his palms. He walked into the jungle to destroy life and walked out to nurture it. That is not tragedy. That is transformation. So when you see his face in that quiet, serious soldier who refused to surrender, remember this: he was never truly fighting the Allies. He was fighting time, and time always wins. But in losing, he became immortal. This was the story of Hiroo Onoda, the soldier who fought for 29 years, a man who mistook silence for battle, but found peace in the echo. May his story remind us that even the longest wars must end, and that peace is not found when the enemy is gone, but when the heart finally understands